statistics of the numbers of Jews killed in each of the given years, 42 is the biggest one. And that's when the concentration camp killing machine started, but it's also when the Einsatzgruppen and you know the sweeping massacres of Jews in Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus was at its height. And the complicity of the local populations is what enabled this to happen. It could not have happened without that. So maybe let's take a step back and appreciate, because we're now looking at what's going on in France, we're looking at what's going on in other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, and I sort of reject facile uses of Holocaust terminology for contemporary situations. You don't call somebody else a Nazi. You don't call, you don't say, oh, this is another Holocaust. I mean, it is a unique tragedy in human history and ought to be recognized as such. And yet, there are genocides, and there have been genocides in other parts of the world. I feel that as Jews who suffered disproportionately throughout history, and specifically in our recent collective memory, we have an added responsibility to speak up when things happen in Rwanda and Cambodia and Darfur, and now in Nigeria. So, but the Holocaust itself was an incremental embodiment of a merger between latent anti-Semitism, ultra-extreme nationalism, and the industrialization of genocide. You weren't able to kill that many people before the tools of murder became enhanced through transport, building camps specifically designed for extermination. There were many concentration camps, but there were 6 extermination camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, probably Auschwitz-Birkenau, right? But the process took time. So it started in Germany, obviously, when President Hindenburg handed over the sort of the right to form a government to Hitler, because his party got a small plurality, by the way. He did not win a majority in 1933. He had less than a third of the seats in the Reichstag, but he was asked to form the government, and he immediately passed what's called the enabling law, which meant there's no government. He's now running Germany autocratically. President Hindenburg was old, I mean, a relic from Bismarck's Prussia. And then very quickly, Jews were stripped of their rights. Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, Kristallnacht in 1938, and it really was, we talked about the frog in the pot syndrome in the last class, it really was incrementally disabling Jews, and it was principally targeted at Jews, but it was also a cleansing, an Aryan cleansing that included gays, communists, socialists, undesirables, the infirm, gypsies, absolutely. And the struggle that I think the Jews who studied this have grappled with a little bit is, how do you preserve the uniqueness of the Holocaust experience as a defining component of post-Holocaust Jewish identity, with the fact that the numbers, our number is 6 million. 11 million people were killed by the Nazis. The next biggest number were Soviet POWs, then undesirable Poles, then the gypsies, then the homosexuals, then the communists, and the socialists. I mean, it was a massive killing machine. They pressed 8.4 million people into forced labor. Again, mostly POWs. Not so many Jews. I mean, most Jews were killed immediately. There were work camps and labor camps, which were sort of the first step to extermination. And the attitude of the world was just shocking. You know, if you look at the Evian conference, if you look at the St. Louis, if you look at other examples where there was an overture to the Western world to be able to to just take in the Jews. I mean, the original German plan, and maybe in Hitler's mind, it was outright extermination. But there was a Havara program before the war started. People asked me why, I think it was in one of the, certainly it was last year in one of the classes, why was there a disproportionate amount of German-made manufacturing equipment in Israel? And that was because two things. One, you had the Havara program in the 1930s where they said basically get out of Germany. Most German Jews were out of Germany before 1939. Unfortunately, a lot of them went to countries that were later taken over by the Germans. So if they escaped to Poland or escaped to Hungary, it wasn't really a long-term escape. And the tragedy of Western passivity was just astounding, right? Because so the British aren't letting the Jews into Palestine. Roosevelt wasn't letting the Jews into the United States. For those of you who've sort of seen me a couple of times, and I'm not saying this to brag, I love history. I really do. I love history. I learned a lot about it. I remember we had a winter vacation in Vermont. We got snowed in. We couldn't go skiing, and they had a little book there about the U.S. presidents. And I read about all the U.S. presidents. I think I was like maybe 10, and so Ford would have been president. Although I don't think he was in the book yet. I think it ended with Nixon. But I read about all the presidents twice, but I skipped over Roosevelt. I didn't want to read that. I mean, I figured like a little 5-year-old, if he covers his eyes, he thinks he's invisible because he can't see. I figured if I skipped 33 to 45, then that period of history just doesn't exist for me because it was too painful, too traumatic, I didn't want to deal with it. And then when I told you the 6 people from my father's family survived, my great uncle was, I met him as an older person, right? I mean, he was probably 50 plus when I was born. So I never knew him as a young man. But during the Holocaust, he was a young man. He never got married. He was in his 20s. He did everything to save the family. He was about the same age as the local commanders, and he went drinking with them and partying with them before they then were given the job to kill Jews. They didn't want to kill him, so they spared him and spared his family and maybe in other towns. Everybody's got 100 near misses. If you have 99 near misses, you're not here to tell the tale. And so he would tell me about what life was like growing up in Czechoslovakia, and I would listen to his stories, but when he started talking to me about the war, I didn't want to hear. It was like cognitive dissonance. I just don't want to hear about it. And then I remember watching a show about Raoul Wallenberg, and I'd never heard of this guy, but it was a positive show. I'm taking you back to the mid-1980s. George Hamilton played Raoul Wallenberg. It was a 2-part series. I saw the Holocaust thing. I didn't want to watch it. Then I sort of watched it. I waited to see the next show. My great uncle was in Switzerland on some business trip, and I was waiting for him to come back because I was now ready to hear those stories. And he passed away in Switzerland. So I never had the benefit of his knowledge base, so I decided to acquire it on my own. I actually did my college thesis on Raoul Wallenberg with footnotes and appendices, 1,000 pages of chronicling his odyssey in the Gulag. Actually tomorrow, January 17th, we'll commemorate the 70th anniversary when he was abducted by the Soviets in Debrecen, Hungary, who they didn't know what to do with him. Right? Here's a guy with his chauffeur showing up in a fancy car, $850,000 worth of valuables that he was holding on behalf of his Jews. He's a scion, but a rejected scion of a prestigious Swedish family, the Wallenbergs. They're like the Swedish Rockefellers. And being financed by the American War Refugee Board to save Jews in Budapest. So they just did what they do with everybody. They arrested him, sent him back to Moscow, and I personally, if you care, based on my research, feel that there's credible evidence that he lived probably till 1975. He was a young man. There were some rumors and sightings later on, certainly till 1960, but Raoul Wallenberg he was born in 1912, he'd be 102. But I mean, in 1975, he would have been 63, so it's not impossible that he could have survived. I think that's a tragedy that still hasn't run its course yet. I think there's a lot more information that ultimately we'll get about his fate. And then it became my job for myself to learn as much as possible, to speak with as many survivors as I could, to understand my mother's story, to understand my father's story. When I graduated from law school and my contemporaries went to Asia, went to Hawaii, they did their sort of post-law school trip before starting work. I went with my parents and my grandmother to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria. I wanted to see the family roots, and then recently I went with my mother to Lithuania, Latvia, and Russia to see where she grew up and to see the daughter of the woman who saved her, who's still alive in Lithuania, and also recognized as a righteous Gentile. Poland had the most righteous Gentiles because it had the most Jews. If you look, you should go look at the Yad Vashem list. You can see by country the number of individuals from each of the constituent countries who are listed as righteous Gentiles. It's fascinating, and it's counterintuitive at first, but when you think about it a little bit more, it makes more sense. That the countries that lost the most Jews also had more people who were involved in saving them. And the Romanians were not extremely Jew-friendly, and they were complicit with the Nazis, but they weren't efficient. They weren't efficient at doing what they were doing, but they weren't completely lethargic like the Hungarians were. Horthy, who wasn't a great man, did not actively get enough Jews for Auschwitz. So the Nazis came with the arrow cross, basically kicked them out, and then their killing machine was extraordinarily efficient under Adolf Eichmann, who famously, we talk about post-Holocaust Jewish identity. I mean, it would have been so much easier for the Mossad to just assassinate Eichmann on Garibaldi Street when they found out who he was and where he was in 1959, but they made a conscious decision. And this, I think, was the most critical inflection point. And Dr. Baron is here and other people who I'm sure were living in Israel at the time. That sort of was the coming of age for the Israeli community to recognize that it has an international responsibility to use the trial of Adolf Eichmann. They didn't have television in Israel yet, right? Television came in 1968, the trial was in 1961. But to use but it was filmed, so you were able to see it, not on sort of a regular broadcast, but to see this live, to hear his testimony, he had counsel, but to hear the prosecution, Yuda Bauer, take this dissection and tell the world what happened, how it happened, who did it, and hold them accountable under the highest standards of international justice. He's the only man ever to be executed in Israel. He was hung in 1962, but his story had to be told, and it was sort of a reckoning for the Israeli population, and then the world. And Holocaust education then sort of became, if you look at books published about the Holocaust, very few books about the Holocaust were published, none in the 50s, very few in the 60s. There was certain, documentary evidence. Now the archives have been completely open. We keep learning more and more about the Holocaust, ironically, as we lose more and more of our survivors. And there's so many ironies. I mean, if I say Bergen-Belsen, what do you think of? It was a because it was a concentration camp. It was a concentration camp. It was particularly active towards the end of the war. It was a destination for a lot of these death marches when people were taken out of concentration camps that were further north and east, back southwest in Lower Saxony where it's located. But it also became a DP camp, a displaced person camp. 2,000 Jewish babies were born in Bergen-Belsen between 1946 and 1950. 2,000. So that's an incredible statistic. When you think about the ability of the Jewish community to move on and regenerate itself in the displaced persons camp, in Israel, in diaspora, it's astounding. Dr. Feingold's in-laws were with the Bielskis in, if you saw the movie Defiance, the story is fairly well known in Novogradic, which is Poland, Belarus. They were among over 1,200 Jews who, one of the most incredible stories, unfortunately there aren't more of these stories, but who fought, built their own community, retained their dignity, retained their humanity, didn't turn people away. 4 brothers. I think this movie is required watching for everybody. And that to me is should be the story of the Holocaust. I told you about the Israelis who approached me in Warsaw. Then I went over to Krakow, took the train, and I walked around to see the Jewish quarter, which is obviously not a Jewish quarter anymore. But there was a fellow by the name of Chris Schwartz, an Englishman, who you could tell by his name that he's got his own identity crisis. But he built a museum to pre-war Judaism. And it was amazing. He thought that because who's his audience? His audience are people who are in Krakow, which is sort of the stopping point to go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They're coming on the March of the Living. They're here to come to see a museum to the 2 million who were exterminated at Auschwitz. He wanted to showcase on a smaller scale with a smaller budget that there was Jewish life in Poland and Jewish life in Europe for 900 years before the Holocaust, a thriving Jewish life with schools and community centers and cemeteries and progeny and a language. I mean, it was amazing to me. He had a singer and a klezmer band that performed that evening. It just so happened to coincide with my visit there, and they were so authentic, but they were all Polish. They weren't, they're singing in Yiddish, but these are native Poles who did this for art, for culture. Yiddish nearly died in the Holocaust. If you think about it, there were 11 million Yiddish-speaking Jews, and 5 million of them perished in the Holocaust. I mean, nearly about 80% of the Jews who were killed were Yiddish speakers. I mean, this was a meaningful international language that effectively disappeared from regular discourse. Ladino also. I mean, Ladino wasn't spoken by nearly as many, but nearly all Greek Jews died during the Holocaust. If you look at the efficiencies, it was a smaller community, but the town of Thessaloniki, which was a major Jewish center for centuries, ever since the expulsion from Spain in 1492, disappeared during the Holocaust. Last week we spoke about what happened in France, and now we know more about it. When you think, I mean, France, my brother is a doctor, and he's supposed to speak, he's an Orthodox, he's supposed to speak at a conference there in a couple of weeks. He asked me if he should go. I say, definitely go. If you don't go, then the terrorists are accomplishing what they're aiming to accomplish. But last week, Friday night, the synagogues in Paris were closed for the first time since World War II. First time since World War II, for different reasons, obviously. But this idea of remembering when the witnesses are gone is a challenge for all of us around the room. Okay, looking around the room, there may be some people who were alive during the Holocaust, but nobody who was really sentient. Maybe if you are and you want to share your story, I want this to be a platform for talking about your experience and how you feel we're going to live that experience going forward. Because we are blessed with survivors in our community. They come to our schools, they shepherd us on our commemorative events, but they won't be with us forever. So we are lucky to have perceived wisdom, perceived experience. We see it, we sense it, we hear it. The next generation will have received wisdom. They'll get it from a text, they'll get it from a story. So, and how do you commemorate that? So, the Yom Kippur prayers are all about martyr, liturgy, the holidays. I mean, the joke is every Jewish holidays, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. But we celebrate the holidays. We celebrate Passover, we celebrate the redemption from Egypt. Purim, same thing. Haman tried to kill all the Jews in Persia, which then had the largest concentration of Jews. They failed. They have a party. Hanukkah, same thing. We don't celebrate the Holocaust. Although I feel I kind of celebrate the redemption on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Even though I think President Obama was wrong when he made the connection in his speech in Cairo, there is a temporal juxtaposition. In other words, they're pretty close in time. And the fact that we have the State of Israel, I think we celebrate redemption from the Holocaust every time I look around the room and see survivors. I think that the commemoration of our survival is what is going to dictate how the next generations relate to that experience. And there's no one formula, and we don't know how it's going to transpire. And this synagogue, one of its many rich traditions is when we say Kaddish, we also do it in memory of those who were lost in the Holocaust. So even if you don't have a direct family member, I grew up in a superstitious family because I'm Jewish, but Yiscor, obviously, if you didn't lose your parent, you get out of synagogue, and you're like one of the lucky ones who still has parents, and thank God I am. But Kaddish, okay, so you can tell who's standing and who's sitting. If you're standing, then you lost somebody. If you're sitting, you don't. So here I stand for the first time because I'm reminded that yes, we've all lost people, and it is a collective identity. But in the Q&A, first what I want to do is I asked Dr. Feingold also to bring his daughter, because he is one example. I'm sure there are other examples of at least 3 generations, direct Holocaust survivor, your experience growing up sort of against the backdrop of that legacy, and then how, sort of being the link in the generational chain, you felt it would be appropriate to transmit it to Ryan and Jessica. And then I want to open the floor through questions and answers, comments, not speeches, but comments, and maybe use that, and I'll sort of moderate. I'll be holding the microphone to just vent and share. And most importantly, the theme of this post-Holocaust Jewish identity: the Holocaust is never going away. It is a signal milestone in Jewish history. And we are not going to be able to legislate to future generations how it will be commemorated, but we do have an opportunity to recognize that it happened and put it in the context that makes sense for us, and to the extent that we have influence over people, our children, our grandchildren, our fellow members in the community, what does it mean going forward? And I want to also recognize, we have from Soroka Hospital, I'm on the Board of Governors of Ben-Gurion University. One of the jewels in our crown is Soroka Hospital in the Negev. We have Dr. Amit Frankel and Rachel Heisler. They're saving lives in Israel, and they're delivering babies in Israel. And Dr. Frankel's in the emergency room, so I guess you see a little bit of both. But we also have Rebecca Sterling with APAC. APAC is the rabbi is on record encouraging all of us to come to Policy Conference. If you want to learn more, please talk to Rebecca. Stand up and let them know that you're here too. Phenomenal organization. We're having the gala dinner, by the way, for Soroka Hospital on Sunday night at the DuPont building on Flagler Street. If you still haven't gotten your ticket, come speak to me. Alan, do you want to say a couple words? Thank you.
In our shul also is a member of Schindler's List, Sam Wertheim.
He passed away, unfortunately.
I know he passed away.
Yes.
He sat in front of me.
Yes.
And Schindler stood under his chuppah after the war in Regensburg, Germany, when he was married.
Yes.
That's an amazing story. So thanks for sharing.
Thanks for